And the negative team to my left is Pembroke. The speaking time for this debate is 8 minutes. A single warning bell will sound 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will sound at the speaking time. Please ensure that your mobile devices are switched off. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Oscar Hazelgrave.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that vaccine passports should be opposed. We, the affirmative team, strongly believe this statement to be true. As the affirmative team, we define the term vaccine passports as a digital certification which will be used as verified proof of someone's COVID-19 vaccination status. This definition is in accordance with the model proposed by the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. According to Cambridge Dictionary, the term should is defined as the ability to express that it is necessary, desirable, or important to perform the action of the following verb. This term iterates the necessity to oppose the aforementioned vaccine passports. Opposed, once again according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is the action of disagreeing with and attempting to prevent an act. Overall, we define this topic as a whole as the necessary desire to put an end to the use of mandatory digital vaccination certificates within Australian society. Prior to discussing why vaccine passports should be opposed, it is necessary to establish the context surrounding this debate. So, why are we discussing vaccine passports? Well, as you are hopefully aware, the COVID-19 virus has impacted Australian society significantly, resulting in the mass production of vaccines combating against the virus and hence the emergence of vaccination passports. Indeed, countries across the globe have begun announcing vaccine passports, forcing their citizens to use proof of vaccination to travel. For example,